We're now moving into part 5, it's a different section, and what I'm trying to do in this part of the book is explain why there are perceived oppositions between theology and, say, philosophy, or theology and science, and or theology and the social science, or psychology, etc. Because I do think that these are perceptions rather than realities, but nonetheless they pass for certainties if they're not examined. And there is a sense in which that is understandable. So, let's take, for example, the great movement of the Enlightenment, which began to gather momentum throughout the late 16th and 17th centuries across Europe. Now, one of the great fathers of Enlightenment was Descartes, who was the great doubter. He doubted things. He wanted to look for certainty. Enlightenment was committed to absolute reason, utter certainty. And he wanted to establish something he could rely on. So he doubted whether he was dreaming, he doubted whether he'd been deceived by a demon, how could he know anything? Eventually he concluded the only thing he could know was that he was thinking. Hence his famous statement, cogito ergo sum. But you can almost feel from Descartes' project, even though he was avowedly, by his own account, a believer, you see why this kind of unsettling idea that rationality depended on systematic doubt would not sit well with theology. Theology, after all, had always seen philosophy, which means love of wisdom, as a kind of servant of theology. Theology was the queen of sciences. Philosophy was to help it, prove its theses, not the other way around. So you had this unsettling desire for certainty. You had characters like David Hume coming on with this kind of mischievous critique, say, of the design argument that the world was beautiful, so God must be great. You say, well, there are one or two things I'm not too keen on, like earthquakes. Maybe God's a bit of the one who made this world is a bit of an apprentice. This idea that, is it really the case that things are so perfect as they might be? You had this idea also that Kant was famous for, which was that God was beyond categories, that God was beyond our acumen, that we couldn't really speak intelligibly about God, because really our categories of knowing were set in our heads with our brain's way of processing information. It couldn't, by almost definition, comprehend a God beyond its intuitions. So you had this kind of sense that the great philosophers were kind of kicking against the goad of the propositions of theology. Worse still, even in biblical studies, characters like David Strauss saying, well, can we really know Jesus? I mean, can we really reach back beyond the centuries to go even beyond the pages of the Gospels to find out what Jesus was really like? Was he maybe not the figure that is presented to us by the church, but possibly a more earthy revolutionary or a protagonist that is not the Son of God and Lord of all that is proposed and proclaimed in the Christian churches? So you had this difficulty that theology was coming up against fundamental questions. But coming up against fundamental questions does not necessarily mean that theology is not engaged with those very fundamental questions. Pascal, a famous mathematician around the same time as the Enlightenment, almost went beyond the questions of doubt and reason by holding close to his heart for most of his life his own experience of what he called a night of fire. That actually the experience of God went beyond the reasonings of doubt and actually conferred on an individual certainties deeper than questions of whether one thinks and therefore one is. You had Schleiermacher challenging what he called a religion and its cultured despisers, saying that the deepest aspect of humanity redounds upon its intuition, that intuition is the source of our deepest insights, that this quest for epistemological or knowledge binaries that someone like Hume was adept at exploring were not where it was at all in terms of being human. The idea that the word itself was leaving behind confusion in the scriptures was turned on its head by someone like the great theologian Karl Barth, who said, hang on a minute, before you ask the questions, let the scriptures ask you questions. This idea that the word of God has entered history, and the word of God is to be listened to first and responded to second. This idea that it is classic Garden of Eden attitude on the part of humanity to think itself smarter than the revealed word of God. So the comebacks, if you like, of theology into this debate varied, and to some extent were explored the ground on which, to question the ground on which some of these debates were taking place. One can point to intriguing areas where Christianity and Christian theology and Enlightenment and later philosophical critique meld. The work of theologians such as Rana and Lonergan with the insights of Immanuel Kant, or the work of linguistic theologians building on the insights of Wittgenstein and his own idea of language games, do point to, as Wittgenstein himself says, the idea that though language is a limited category, it's something that we can't find useful in all circumstances. He says, whereof we cannot speak, thereof we must remain silent. Nonetheless, he himself saw in the Christian revelation, in Christian theology in particular, something that pointed beyond itself. And this he found intriguing, the idea that ultimately the revelation of Christian theology is, again, to go back to that first proclamation, the idea that one must change one's life. And that is at the core of Christian discourse, not desiccated theological and philosophical abstractions.